Hello, everyone. Thank you for checking out this special episode of Really Dicey. This is Manny, and I am here with,
Lynne Hardy, the Associate Editor for the Call of Cthulhu game.
yes, we're going to talk about Regency Cthulhu, Cthulhu during the time of the very popular Jane Austen novels, using their setting and time. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us about this book. Can you tell us a little bit about where the idea for this originated?
Well, I love the Regency period. I grew up with Jane Austen's works in various forms in my house. My mum was a huge fan of Pride and Prejudice, so I remember seeing a very early BBC TV adaptation of it in, I think it was the late 70s, early 80s. We had various versions of it as what they call audiobooks these days, but they used to be called sort of I can't remember what they used to call them now, but audiobooks basically version of Pride and Prejudice. And they were always there. Uh, um, I actually didn't read Pride and Prejudice until I was a lot older myself, but I did manage to write an essay on the differences between the Laurence Olivier film version and the actual novel based on the audiobook that I'd listened to until I pretty much wore the tapes out, to be fair. And I got an A grade for that exam, so there we go. Um, so I've always loved the Regency. The area that I grew up in was called the Dukeries. So a lot of these grand houses that Jane Austen describes, they're of the right period for where I grew up. I spent my childhood going and visiting them. A lot of the ones that were used in the infamous Colin Firth BBC production were actually filmed not too far from where I lived and grew up. So, it's I was steeped in it. So it's always been an era that I was very interested in. But to how we ended up with it as a game setting, Andrew Peregrine, who is a lovely, lovely guy, has worked for pretty much every game company going, has got stuff in all sorts of products because he's very versatile and he's a good writer and he's lovely to work with as well. He'd basically sent Mike some pitches for scenarios set through different time periods. And the one that really caught Mike's eye was the Regency one. And it caught my eye too when it's sort of like, Mike was discussing it with me. Um, and I looked at it, and what we found is that people like sort of collections of scenarios set in a specific era. If you have lots of scenarios set in different eras, that particular book doesn't sell necessarily very well because people like to play in a fixed setting. They don't necessarily like to dot around. So they've got some continuity for their investigators. So I was looking at Andy's scenario, which is The Long Corridor. That was the first one he sent us. And there were already character creation rules in there to make sure that you could tailor your investigator to the Regency era. And I was just looking at this thinking, this needs to be expanded. This needs more. This can be a book of its own, really. This could be a nice little micro setting that would fit nicely between Reign of Terror and Gaslight. Because it's not too long after Reign of Terror.
Mm.
Okay, there's a bit of a gap between the end of the Regency period, which officially is really 1820, but it kind of, a lot of people let it kind of run up to when Victoria actually gets onto the throne. So it's sort of, two existing products kind of bookended it quite nicely. So I twisted Mike's arm, convinced him this was a good idea. I managed to get him to agree. So I went back to Andy and, said, we need expanded character creation, we need a setting, we need another scenario. And Andy went away and produced that. And then I wrote a history section, tweaked some of the rules so that they helped align with what we already got and support the role playing ideas that both Andy and myself wanted to really highlight. And there we go. That's how we ended up with the source book.
What do you think of, what do you think Jane Austen's works and this time period is so fascinating to explore? Why do you think that her books, even now, even now to this day, we're still seeing adaptations to it?
Adaptations, in some ways, costume dramas are very pretty to look at. And they are, without a doubt, they're a feast for the eyes. And I think that's one of the reasons that they get picked. I think one of the other reasons that they get picked is that the stories are in many ways timeless. It's all about your position in society and navigating the pitfalls of interacting with people at different levels of society. And that is one of the things that is fascinating about the era and about Jane Austen's works, in the fact that they're actually fairly biting social satires. People tend to remember the romance stuff because that's often what gets played up in adaptations, because that's easier to sell, it's easier to adapt. But they really are blistering social critiques on the snobbery, the class struggles, and just the downright unfairness of the system. Because obviously it's the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, and it's setting the stage for a lot of what actually happens under Queen Victoria. And it's a very restrictive society, because you've got the top 6 to 10% of the country, who are incredibly wealthy compared to the other 90 to 94% of the who are living in poverty. And it's just that clash of worlds, that clash of ideas. It's the old guard trying to keep out the nouveau riche who've made their money in trade. And it's all about protecting your circles, and maintaining your influence in the face of a massively changing world. So I think that's a very rich ground for role playing beyond just the pretty frocks.
Hmm. So how do you balance the tone of the game?
Well as the romance, it is an era of, massive social upheaval. And that does come through in some of Austen's works. But again, it's not necessarily the thing that gets picked up in the adaptations. We're dealing with an era where a lot of modern technology has yet to develop. Things are still lit by candlelight. That gaslighting is starting to come in, but that's still not standard by any means. So, you've got this huge pool of shadow that nasty things can be lurking in. You've got all these societal strictures that restrict your behavior. You've got a fundamental belief in God, and the might of the British Empire by this point. So anything that you can throw in there that unsettles that is actually really psychologically very interesting. So the mythos butting up against, the earlier stages of the British Empire, and its beliefs and mores is fascinating, because it is going to be deeply unsettling for people who are used to being looked up to, deferred to, and respected, dealing with things that couldn't care less.
Hmm. So let's talk a little bit about the book. So there are 4 chapters. The first chapter helps you build an investigator during this time period. The second one deals with the setting up Tarryford, and then there's 2 adventures: the Long Corridor and the Emptiness Within. Well, I love the titles for some of these adventures that they keep putting out. But let's talk about Regency Investigator. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Like what I mean, besides obviously different time period, different skill sets, is there anything else included about this chapter that you wanted to share?
Well, one of the things, obviously, both Andy and myself are huge Jane Austen fans. Andy's been talking about doing a Jane Austen game of his own for years, and never quite getting around to it. So this was a good opportunity to actually make him write a Jane Austen game, even if it wasn't necessarily the one he'd always intended to write. So because we can't assume that other people know British history in the 17th and 18th centuries, and the run up to what's going on in the beginning of the 19th century in the actual Regency, which is 1811 to 1820 officially. So I wanted to make sure that there was a good grounding, so people knew what had gone on before and what had kind of led up to this point. So you've got the American War of Independence, you've got the French Revolution just beforehand, you've got the Napoleonic Wars going on at the same time, you've got various elements of the Industrial Revolution kicking off. So I wanted to make sure that people who came to the game who weren't history nerds, or at least that particular era, and who didn't know Jane Austen's work, had a good solid grounding, so that they knew what sort of investigators they would be creating and where they fitted into society. Andy wrote some very good information on what those society rules were, again, to give guidance and support to players and the GM, so that they know what that social structure is like. One of the main things that we developed was the reputation system, which is a new system because normally how people react to you in many ways is defined by your credit rating. So in the 1920s, that's fine. If you've got a ton of money in the 1920s, people are going to be nice to you because people are used to people from all walks of life having lots of money. Obviously, the class system in America isn't quite the same as entrenched as it is in Britain. So by that point in time, high credit rating, lots of money, social standing, low credit rating, not much money, not much social standing. That's not the case in the Regency period. You've got the old guard, the gentry and the nobility at the very top end of the social structure. Now, they've got a huge amount of respect from society because that's what's expected. But they don't necessarily have a lot of money. Some do. Some are ridiculously wealthy, even by today's standards. But having a high social standing does not immediately equate to a lot of cash. So your reputation and your credit rating don't necessarily align that well. So we needed something that reflected the fact that you could be, you could have a very high social standing, but a very low credit rating because you were effectively a poor nobleman. You'd inherited this rundown, drafty, falling apart manor house, but no longer had the income because the estates had been split up over the generations to actually pay for its upkeep and to its death duties and taxes and goodness knows what else. We also wanted something that would reflect the growing or the developing mercantile class, which would later on become the middle class. That doesn't technically exist in the Regency period, but it's starting because the Industrial Revolution is coming through. So these people have no social standing whatsoever. They're tradesmen, but they have a lot of money. So you can have a very high reputation score, but a low credit rating, and a high credit rating and a low reputation score. And that was there to sort of like show this weird dichotomy that you had in that period, that wealth did not necessarily equal status.
Hmm. So it's possible that you could start a character with a high status, low money, or high money, low status.
Yes.
Interesting. Yeah, that is hard to wrap your head around, especially in our contemporary times. Tarryford, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. I apologize.
Well, most Brits would go for Tarryford. You
Tarryford.
kind of
Okay.
drop the art.
Okay. I have always have trouble. Massachusetts has a lot of towns like that, also. That
Well, yes,
don't.
because Massachusetts obviously has got an awful lot of British town names just literally transplanted over. So yes, you say them very differently to the way we say them.
Yeah. So this city, what can you tell us about? Is it actually based on a real place? Is this fictional?
As far as I know, because Andy created it, it's fictional, but it is based on a lot of small towns and villages that would exist. It's set in Wiltshire, which is in sort of which usually referred to in literature terms as the whole of Wessex. So that's the ancient historical kingdom of Wessex. Um, and there are lots of these beautiful little old-fashioned towns still down there. I mean, that's where an awful lot of these adaptations end up being filmed if they're not filmed in the Chilterns, because they're very small, they're very picturesque. They haven't really changed a huge amount. They might have got slightly larger, but then as workers migrated into the cities, they kind of contracted again. So it's based on reality, but it's not real.
Hmm. And before we talk about the adventures, how how is the game set up so that you can weave the Cthulhu mythos into the setting? Because I mean, this setting in itself, without it, it's difficult. I mean, especially if you're a woman during this time period, So in itself, there's probably enough exciting stories to tell just from this section of the world, this section of history alone, this section of the world. So how is the mythos weaved into the setting?
Well, the way that Andy set it up is that basically this is a very unfortunate part of Wiltshire. There's a lot of things happened in its past, which means it's not exactly the most stable place in the world in terms of the boundaries between reality and unreality. So there's scope for lots of strange things. Obviously, Wiltshire is where Stonehenge is, it's where Avebury is. So you've got these big Neolithic stone circles, you've got all sorts of ancient earthworks, and that may or may not have mythos connotations in your world. So, there's an awful lot of stuff going on down there that makes it ripe for just gently inserting the mythos kind of in the shadows and round the corner for people to stumble across.
Hmm. Now, I don't want to spoil anything about the two adventures, so I'm just gonna ask a general question. What can you share? What are your thoughts about the two adventures, the long corridor and the emptiness within? Are they connected? Are they separate adventures?
They're separate adventures, but you can run them as a mini campaign. So one technically takes place a year after the other. So Emptiness Within effectively takes place a year after the events of the Long Corridor, provided Tarryford hasn't burnt down, blown up, and sunk into the swamp by that point in time, because the investigators get things a bit wrong in the first scenario. Um, what I can say is that they're very entertaining to play. When we were playtesting them, we had an absolute hoot. It took far longer to playtest them than I anticipated, because everybody was really up for going for the character play. They were really throwing themselves into the role playing, their characters and their social interactions, as well as dealing with the mystery. So you've got those two things that you are playing with and balancing, is the working out what's going on with the mythos, but also maintaining your position in society and exploring your position in society, and trying not to get caught by society doing weird things while you're hunting out the mythos. Because let's face it, in this period, the sort of behavior that most investigators get up to is going to get you censured very, very quickly by society, and ostracized and shunned. So you it requires a little bit more guile and thought and stealth than might necessarily be your standard investigator behavior. Because let's face it, we know investigators like to grab a whole load of firearms and explosives and just set everything on fire. Not quite as straightforward in the Regency period.
Hmm. May I ask what were some of your favorite parts of writing this book?
Well, I love doing the historical research, and I always find that fascinating. When did things happen? And things invariably either happen much later than you expect, or they happen much earlier than you expected. So that was really interesting. It was a joy to work with Andy. I've been trying to get to work with him on something larger scale for quite a long time now. So that was fantastic. That was an absolute pleasure. Um, Developing the town and the characters, and making sure that the scenarios had support for beginners. So this is something that people without a lot of experience of Call of Cthulhu can come and play, because I wanted to make sure there was a lot of support in there, sort of following on in the footsteps of Doors to Darkness and Gateways to Terror, so that once you've played a few things, you can maybe try now a different time period setting,
Hmm.
but
Uh,
still make sure there's the support there to give it to people if they need it.
hmm. Um, Anyone that plays this book, or uses this book to play Call of Cthulhu, what are there maybe any messages, anything that you hope that they get out of it from playing this game?
I hope they have a lot of fun. I mean, that's the main part. I really do hope they enjoy it. Um, I hope they get a slightly different experience to what they would normally do with 1920s American-based Call of Cthulhu, because you said the whole social setting is totally different. So I hope that they do get a very different perspective on the mythos. We did put pulp rules in as well, so if you want to do your Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies, you certainly can do. And I think that would be absolutely hilarious, to be quite honest. I haven't tested that, but I'm sure it would be great fun, and I'm sure people will have a great deal of fun with that too.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think that's the main thing, is that have fun and have a slightly different experience to the one that you would normally have with classic Call of Cthulhu.
Hmm. If you were to make a character for this book, what character would you make?
You see, everybody always expects you to say Elizabeth Bennet. And yeah, quite possibly. It would be fun to see what Lizzie Bennet would do running around fighting the mythos. Um, I don't know. Because I was keepering it. So, um, who would I? Who would I do? I think I might actually play a boxer. There were some very famous boxers in the era who actually rose to quite social prominence. And again, this is this weird thing because as in every era, celebrity gets you past an awful lot of doors that you wouldn't otherwise necessarily. There was a black boxer whose name is currently escaping me, but he was very, very famous, and he ended up owning pubs and training other fighters. And I think just playing something slightly different would be very interesting
Hmm.
because I usually quite often end up playing academic types. So it would be nice to just play a pugilist instead of, your professor or somebody from academia.
Hmm. Okay. Is there any last words you want to say about this book that I haven't asked you about?
The setting is primarily Jane Austen. So it's British based, it's dealing with the social issues and the mythos. But obviously, this is a very, very rich period of history. You've got, the developing United States. It's not long had its independence. You've got all the stuff going off in France with the Napoleonic Wars. You've got hideous things going off in India with the East India Company and various other countries, East India companies all around the world. So this is still a very much an era of empire building by several nations. So you've got a lot of scope to go and explore other things as long as you do it respectfully.
Hmm.
Because these are fairly grim times for an awful lot of people. And don't treat that lightly.
Hmm. So, if I may ask, what is next? What is there anything? Um, are you currently working on any projects that you can share and talk about?
Okay, we're putting the finishing touches to Rivers of London at the moment, obviously. But other than that, the things that I'm working on haven't actually been announced yet, and I'm now splitting my time between Call of Cthulhu and Rivers of London. So
Okay, all right, excellent, excellent. That's I can't wait for that book to come out as well. Um, but yes, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about this book. I'm really excited about it. I've been waiting for this time period to come out in a book form so that because I have so many friends I want to play in this setting. So yes, thank you very much. And to our viewers, be safe out there. Happy Halloween. We'll see you soon.
bye.